We're talking today with Bill Sikma of Grand Rapids, Michigan. The interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Bill, start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born in Ocheyedan, Iowa in 1929, which was, the end of the great, wonderful years and moving right into the Depression era.
Right. Now, what did your family do for a living when you were a kid?
We farmed.
Okay. What part of Iowa is Ocheyedan in?
It's the northwest corner, Osceola County.
Okay. And now, did your family own its farm, or did they rent land, or?
When I was young, we rented a farm, and then we purchased a farm just 2 miles straight east of Ocheyedan, Iowa.
Okay. How old were you when they bought the farm?
I must have been about 7 or 8 years old. I was right in that
Okay.
period.
So that's still during the period of the Depression.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So how was your father able to buy a farm at that point?
I'm not sure why, because I was, the middle kid of,
Right.
of 7 boys. So I'm not exactly sure, except that that they were trying to push that sort of a thing. And so I don't know the details of the financial thing, but he was, he had farmed for several years, and he had done okay as a farmer.
Okay.
And he always had enough livestock that you could keep turning over, which supplied part of our income.
All right. Because you hear a lot about people losing their farms during that period. I don't hear as often where they actually get to buy one, but that's what happened with you. Okay. Now, do you remember how you heard about Pearl Harbor? You would still have been a kid, but...
Well, when we were still living on the rental farm, my oldest brother was about 16 years old. And he said, "We live in such boring times." My dad says, "Son, it's unfortunate, but you are exactly the right years. You are going to be in the service fighting the Japanese." And I thought it was interesting, as Iowa farmer, knowing we were going to fight the Japanese. It would have been surprising if our president at that time was not very much aware of that also.
Okay. So basically your father is saying this before Pearl Harbor happens.
Yes,
Okay.
that we will be fighting the Japanese, and my oldest brother would be the right age to be drafted for that war.
All right. So when it does happen, how did you hear about it?
Well, it was in Sunday morning in church time.
Okay.
We were at church, and we heard about it. Because the time difference from Pearl Harbor to Iowa meant that was about right at noontime at church.
All right. So now, did your brother get drafted?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
And he drove a deuce and a half in the South Pacific island hopping. His deuce and a half was loaded with either gasoline or live ammunition. So he had a pretty dangerous job.
Okay. But did he come back in one piece?
Yes, he did.
Okay. All right. Now, you were a little too young for all of that. As it was, the war ends, of course, before you're old enough to get
Yes.
into it. Now, did you follow events fairly carefully, or just go about being a kid?
Well, what do you mean by following events?
I mean, did you pay attention to what was happening in the war while it was going on?
My dad he was an Iowa farmer, but he read, whenever he had time. And so we were very much up on what was going on.
Okay. And did your brother write home when he was overseas, or?
Well, you couldn't really write, it was, had a little small sheet of paper that you could write certain information, but everything that he wrote was censored.
Okay.
So he couldn't say anything about what his life was like over there.
Right. Okay. Now, so the war ends, and you're still, what,
I had
16?
2 other brothers who were in the service
Okay.
during the Second World War. The second brother was allergic to wool, so he was released. My The third brother, he was on an aircraft carrier.
Okay. Now, did you finish high school?
Yes.
Okay, and when did you graduate from high school? That would have been,
Let's see,
47, 48?
I'm not exactly sure, but I think it'd be 48.
Okay, all right. And then what did you do after you finished high school?
Well, then worked on the farm, and that was a transition. You know, when I was very young, farmers never used tractors because they weren't around.
Mm-hmm.
But then later on, then you know, we got used tractors to farm, and we built a new round roof barn because the old one was the old type barn, a silo. We built all of that, and the surprising thing to me was a year and a half ago I went to Iowa just to look at this farm, and it was gone because the people that were farming at that time, instead of 2-row corn planters, they had 22-row corn planters, and so they didn't want to be paying interest in any residential, and so the farms were just destroyed completely, and the land was farmed right over where they were.
So is this like large agribusiness taking over, or just a big independent farmer?
Independent farmers, you know, it used to be when I was young, there was in a square section of land there would be 4 farms.
Right.
And most farmers had a quarter section
Right.
of land. And then as equipment increased and they had larger farms, and today the farms are much larger. They'd have to have at least 4 sections of land, 4 sections of land, because to have a tractor that has 22 rows to plant, and when he sits inside of his tractor, he sets the computer, and the computer drives that tractor straight down the row, and if any of the grain runs out of any of the boxes, it automatically stops the tractor. So everything is computer controlled
Mm-hmm.
now, and obviously to be able to afford that kind of equipment, you have to have very large farms.
Right. Okay. So basically, after you finished school, you stayed on the farm and you had plenty of work to do at that point.
Yes.
And then eventually you get married, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. And when?
See, when our church in Ocheyedan, Iowa, was typical country church, and my dad wanted us to have a Christian school, so my brothers and I helped him get a house mover, and we pulled a building onto the churchyard that was big enough so it's a 2-room school.
Mm-hmm.
And the 3rd year of that Christian school, my wife came to teach. And so that's how we met. And then of course, obviously we got married.
Mm-hmm.
And 2 months after I was married, I was drafted in the Korean War.
Okay. Now, when you got married, did you move out of your parents' house, or?
Well, I was, of the boys, my dad liked my style, so I was going to be the one who farmed the family farm. So
Right.
we had a little house moved there
Okay.
onto this bigger farm. But while I was in the service, my dad had some health problems, so my brother, just younger than I, was still in the United States in the service.
Mm-hmm.
And they said he can come home. So my younger brother was then on the farm.
Mm-hmm.
So then I said, I don't want to be working as a mechanic somewhere or something. So I said, I want to go to Calvin College on the GI Bill.
Okay, but that's getting ahead of ourselves in the story. So basically, initially, the plan was you were going to get married, you could live in the house that was on the farm, but then Uncle Sam came calling.
Yes.
And I guess we decided that was summer of 1951, basically, when you get drafted. All right. Now, when you get drafted, where do you go for basic training?
Went to Fort Knox.
Okay, Kentucky. All right. How did they get you down there?
We rode on a train.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, did you go somewhere else first, Detroit or Chicago, for processing, or did you just go straight down? Actually,
let's see.
actually,
we
guess
left,
from Iowa, you might have gone to Chicago or St. Louis or somewhere.
I think we went down through Missouri, but I do not know the
Okay.
exact route.
Right.
Being a kid on the farm, I wasn't aware of the details of that.
Okay. But basically, you went to Fort Knox. Now, what did your basic training consist of?
Well, we were put in tankers basic training, not the infantry,
Okay.
which was, you know, an Iowa farmer, that was great. And so we were trained, you know, using the Army tanks.
What kinds of tanks were you training in?
Um,
You're still in Shermans at that point, or?
Yeah, it was a large tank. Yeah, I don't remember the exact kind, but it was a, you know, heavy tank.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And what different kinds of things do they teach you? Is it driving the tank or using the gun, or?
You had to know as much about the tank as you could learn.
Mm-hmm.
You had to learn how to adjust carburetors, that carburetors working, making the engine run. You had to know how to drive the thing. You had to learn how to shoot the cannon on the tank, you know, and so you had to learn everything about the tank.
Okay. Now, in addition to learning the tank, did they give you sort of marching, drill, discipline, that kind of thing?
Oh yes, we had marched to classes, and we were trained differently than the infantry, because one of the parts of training was you had to go through what was called an infiltration course, and this course had wires that you had to crawl under and things of that sort. And when we went through that, for the tankers, we just had a carbine. The infantry people had the M1. The surprising thing to me was, you know, we strapped that thing on our shoulders and crawled through there, and they would shoot over our head. We had to do it in the daytime and then at night. Well, an infantry person hadn't been able to go through that course with his company. He was assigned to go through that course with his M1 rifle, and he didn't drag his rifle along with him. He had it propped up. If a spot of dirt got on his rifle, he had to go back and go through the course again.
Mm-hmm.
So the training for that was obviously necessary, because in the infantry you had to be able to use your rifle.
Right.
In the tanks, you know.
Yeah. A tanker is not normally going to be using his carbine.
Right.
So.
So there was a difference in our training.
Okay. Now, how did the drill instructors treat you?
I don't know why, but this was just we were just moving into the time when the blacks were included, and for some reason or other, my sergeant of our company liked me very much, and it maybe wasn't fair, but I never pulled guards during the night. I never had to work in the kitchen, so I was treated better than. I was the squad leader of my squad,
Okay.
and so I was treated very well.
Okay. How does that connect with the Army integrating? Were there black recruits along with you who were?
Yes.
And they got more of the bad jobs?
No.
Okay.
Well, it depended where they were from.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was, some of them were actually, you know, criminals, and they had a very rough time.
Mm-hmm.
And others fell in line, you know, pretty much. So it depended on their background. So they could do the same training that we could, but
Okay.
but part of the problem was they were not used to discipline like we were.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the differences, I would say.
Okay, so it depends on how you're brought up.
It was
to a
how
certain
you were
extent.
brought up, and you know, some of those had come from Chicago, and they were used to a different lifestyle,
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't want to obey the drill sergeant and so forth.
Right.
So there were those differences.
Okay. Now, how long did basic training last?
Let's see, 12 weeks.
Okay. All right. Now, were there a lot of people you were training with, because you're training for armor, who had experience with heavy machinery or trucks or things like that, or was it just a
Well,
bunch of different people?
a bunch of different people, and there were some people that didn't have any clue about running machinery.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that was all part of the basic training, and they had to learn it.
Okay.
And
Now,
the important thing, of course, is that tank had to be ready to go all the time. So when we had a lot of rain, we'd go through a lot of mud. That tank had to be washed spotless before we went to bed at night. You know, so we had to really take good care of it. And for some people, that seemed unnecessary, but we had to do it, and so our equipment was well taken care of.
mm-hmm. Okay. And you had worked with tractors before.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because out on the farm, and so you're used to a lot of those kinds of
Right.
things to begin with. Okay. Now, once you got to the end of that 12 weeks, now what happens to you?
Well, then we got to leave, and then we were shipped overseas
Okay. And where did they send you?
from Chicago.
Okay. And where did you go to?
Went to after that. We went to, actually it was southern part of Germany.
Right. Okay. Now, how did they get you from Chicago to Germany?
Well, we went on it by ship
Mm-hmm. Now, did you sail off the East Coast somewhere?
from New York someplace.
Okay, so you take a train from Chicago to New York and
Yeah.
then get on a ship. All right. And what kind of ship were you on?
This was a very large ship, and so it was like it had four decks, you know, and the ships followed because of the currents of the ocean. On the way down to Europe, we went to the northern route, and then
Mhm.
of course, obviously, when we came back, we did the southern
Right.
route.
Okay. Now, was this a ship that was kind of built as a troop ship, do you think, or?
I don't think it was built as a troop ship, but it was used as a troop ship.
Okay. Because in World War II, they used converted ocean liners sometimes, but they also had purpose-built troop
Well,
transports.
this was just a passenger ship.
Okay. All right. And about how long did it take to get across the ocean?
Well, it took us less than 2 weeks. I don't know, it was about something like 10 days or something
Okay.
like that.
All right. And what was the weather like on the way over?
Well, first it was very nice weather, and then we had a storm or something in the middle of the night, and I was up on a higher bunk, and I don't know what, the ship vibrated so much I bounced right out of my bed, but fortunately I could reach both sides and grab the bunks, and so that I didn't fall to the floor. But so then it was very rough, and then it was I think it was Easter holiday, or anyway, it was a holiday, and so that Sunday we had a fabulous meal, and so we went to the kitchen area, and we'd take this meal, and we're sitting on the table. Well, some guys couldn't handle this, and so they jumped up and headed for the bathroom, and their dishes were all slid off, and the corner of the room was piled with broken dishes and stuff like that. Fortunately for me, I didn't get seasick, so I enjoyed my meal.
Okay. And then thinking about the timing of this, if you had gone into the service in maybe August of '51, and this might put you like around Christmas rather than Easter.
No, it was in the new year.
Okay. All right. I'm just trying to figure out the timetable here, but all right.
Yeah.
But so it's basically spring of '52 by this time. Okay. Now, while you were back in Fort Knox, did you expect that you might have to go to Korea, or did you think because you were an armor you'd probably go to Germany?
We had no clue where we'd be, you know, they don't tell you anything.
Right.
And people were trying to guess, but it just happened to be, and so then the interesting thing was we were all out of basic training, and everybody that was sent overseas to Germany were those who were just finished training. So we all went as PFCs, wound up in Germany, but we had our rank frozen. So you could not be promoted.
Was that because there were too many non-coms in Germany already and they didn't need anybody else?
It was a financial thing. The money,
Okay.
the rank was you know, in the combat area.
Mm-hmm. All right. So they didn't want to spend any more money than they had to on you guys, so you had your rank
When we
first.
came back after not quite, it was almost 2 years,
Mm-hmm.
and the ship had only PFCs on it except for one person who happened to be a corporal.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, do you remember where you landed in Germany? In Hamburg or Bremen or somewhere else?
I didn't know where we were. We were
Okay.
just a crowd of people, and it was northern part of Germany
Right.
somewhere.
Right, because you have to come in from the ocean.
Yeah.
So yeah. And then, how did you get to your base?
Well, then we were put on a train.
Okay.
We were all put on a train and got to Ansbach, I think it was. Ansbach,
right.
Germany.
All right. And what unit did you join?
I was born the Second Armored Cavalry,
Okay.
which is a tank unit.
Okay. And how did they receive you, or what kind of welcome do you get when you show up?
The guys that were there enjoyed showing their superiority to these new recruits.
So, what was your initial assignment?
It was being a gunner on, these were light tanks. In Germany, we only had light tanks.
Okay. That might have been the Chaffey tank at that point. So, not the old Stuart from World War II,
No.
but a more modern tank.
It was somewhat more modern, but I don't remember exactly the type it was even now. So
Okay.
long ago. But
All right.
it was a light tank, and they were very fast.
Mm-hmm.
So we know they would go 50 miles an hour.
All right. Now you said that the old guys showed their superiority. How did they do that?
Well, they had fun with, you know how guys had fun with recruits, and but it was a good unit, you know, and we were a very cohesive group. We all worked together, no question about it.
Okay. How many men would be in a crew for these tanks?
5.
Okay.
You had the driver and the assistant driver up front, and then you had the gunner, and that's what I was,
Mm-hmm.
and the loader to lower your tanks, and then you had the tank commander.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the gunner was basically in charge after the commander. So if
Mhm.
he wasn't on the tank, then I was in charge of the tank. So
Okay. So, how did you wind up as number 2 guy in your tank if you're the new guy?
well, I understood the tanks, and I was a farm kid, and
Yeah.
you just like to do things,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And there were other people, you know, like my loader. He was always feeling sorry for himself. In fact, he would panic and lose control for really no reason at all. When he was in the civilian life, that was when they still had elevator operators. That was his job,
Mm-hmm.
and so he had no skills at all. But he could move the ammunition over so he could load the tank. So that was his job.
Okay.
The driver of the tank also had to have significant ability to drive the tank, but we all had to have every position in the tank that we could do.
Right. Okay. So now, once you've joined the unit, do you go into some kind of regular routine with it?
You'd have 1 month that you'd be doing border patrol, so you'd go to these checkpoints with your tank.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'd come back, and then you would service your tank, and that was spending about a month in the motor pool, and that was boring, to say the least, because you run out of things to do. And then we'd have 1 month in which we'd do what was called a bivouac. You'd go out and go different places for training, and
Right.
just to be able to move as a unit cohesively.
All right. And what kind of base facilities did you have, or what kind of quarters did you have?
Well, they were very nice barracks, what the Germans had before.
Mm-hmm.
They were very nice barracks, and So you had usually two guys, it'd be 2 or 4 guys to a room, but like I was in a room with just one other person.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was like apartment living almost. So it was
Okay.
very, very nice living.
All right. And did they have any Germans working on the base, or was it all just military personnel?
No, they had civilians working.
Okay.
Uh,
And what would they do?
Well, they would do the general things like cleaning up, things like that, things that the military people themselves didn't want to do.
Okay. And did you pretty much spend all of your time on the base or in the field, or did you get to go into town?
Well, you could have weekend leaves,
Okay.
yeah.
And,
You could go into town, yeah.
okay. What impression did you have of the Germans themselves?
Well, they, we didn't have much in common with them, but, we didn't have any problem with any of them. They were nice people,
Mhm.
just like any people, and when they worked, they liked to work on the base because there would have some income.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were always very cooperative that way, so got a pretty decent impression of them.
Okay.
But if we were someplace, I didn't know German when I first got there, and so if you didn't know something, you'd ask a kid, and the German kids knew English.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't ask older persons because they probably didn't understand you.
Okay. Now, could you still see evidence of the effects of World War II, or?
Well, yes. Some of the buildings in larger cities like the capital area there in Marne, the inside of the city was just completely destroyed, and there was the walls there. And so when we first got there, we saw evidence of a lot of the damage of the war yet.
Mm-hmm.
And that was quite a long time after the war.
Yeah, it's 52, yeah, so you're kind of getting on there. Now, did you also see any indication of economic recovery or things getting better? Did people seem to be still pretty poor?
Well, we didn't have much association with the civilian
Okay.
population,
Mm-hmm.
and they made it a point that we didn't have,
All right. Did they give you any kind of warnings or instructions regarding how you were supposed to behave when you went off base?
No. If you got in trouble with, then you got back on base and you were penalized, so,
Mhm.
But it was, but being married, I didn't spend any time in the beer halls like
Mhm.
a lot of my friends did. And one of the problems they had is they would have, after about 1 or 2 weekends, all their money was gone, and they didn't have anything till the next payday,
Mhm. All right. Now, while you were in Germany, did you get to travel around much at all or see anything?
Yes, like, I took a leave and went to the Netherlands with a friend of mine, and so we visited the Netherlands. And the people in the Netherlands, when they found out that I spoke English and I was from the United States, they would do anything. They just went out of their way to help us. When we went to France, the French people didn't like the GIs, so and they some of them refused to speak English.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we were on leave there, they'd ask somebody and they couldn't understand, Well, there was always somebody who realized that would cost them money, so they would step in and cooperate.
Mhm.
But the French didn't like us very well.
Yeah. All right. Now, you started out as a gunner on a tank, but did your duties change later on?
Well, yes. First of all, one of the things that I couldn't believe, why we'd go out on an artillery range and shoot for these targets. And you know, being a farm kid, you knew how to do things. So they had a target that would come at an angle behind a little hill, and we were supposed to aim at that target. So the first thing I did is when my crosshairs hit this target, I pulled the trigger, and when my shell landed, I watched where the target was.
Mm-hmm.
So when the target came back, at that point I pulled the trigger, and of course hit the target.
Mm-hmm.
They let me shoot 4 targets, and then the rest of the day they would not let me shoot anymore. They said I was destroying too many targets.
Oh.
What bothered me was, how come these other fellows were sitting there all day, sitting there banging those guns going off, and they're shooting all that ammunition, you know, because if you use common sense, you'd know exactly how to do it, you know.
Mhm.
So that, I said, I'd hate to be in combat with some of these guys, you know. So the training we had though was good, and
Okay. But then, did you then change jobs at some point?
well, yes. Then the people who were our communications people, they'd been in Germany long enough, and they wanted them over to Korea, so they left. And then they said, we need somebody to be learning Morse Code for messages. And so because of my grades, they said I had to go to that school. My company commander said, no, we're not going to leave him go. I'm keeping him here.
Mm-hmm.
And the higher headquarters said, he is going. You know, you can't stop us. He's going because of the test scores he had. And
Mm-hmm.
so then, then of course you do have to sign some papers. And I said, if after I'm finished with radio operator, you will let me go to radio repair school, then I'll sign this paper. He said, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, after the radio operator, I was radio repair.
Good.
And so then our company had lost because they were transferred out. I was, and because farm kid, you knew how to do things, I was a commo chief at that time, which was kind of nice.
Okay. Let's back up in the story a little bit. The Morse Code radio training, what was that like?
Well, you went to these classes and you sat in this classroom and with the headset on, and they sent Morse Code to you, and you had to learn the different sounds.
Mm-hmm.
Da 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 da. That would be three different letters. So
Right.
you had to know the whole alphabet by listening to that Morse Code.
Okay. And how long did they have you do that?
I don't remember exactly. I think it was about 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And 6 weeks of that was enough?
It was more than enough.
Okay.
And so then, as soon as I got back to the company, they said, okay, now you can come to a different place and take radio repair,
Okay.
which I liked very much.
All right. And how long did you spend doing that? Or how much for the training?
About this, it seemed like that was the length of whenever you were out for, that was about the length of a course.
Now, were you doing all of this on the same base, or did they send you to other bases?
No, they sent you different locations in Germany.
Okay. And then, once you finish the training, then you return back to, do you go back to your own company?
My own company, yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
But now you're communications chief?
Then they said I was communications chief, and they said we need a ranking person. So we'll give you your sergeant stripes, but you have to enlist for 6 more months.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I'm married and I've got a wife back home, and there's no way I'm going to do that. So what they had to do, they got somebody from another company who was a corporal,
Mm-hmm.
and then, so had that rank. But he was from our company commander. He was practically ignored because he didn't have management skills at all,
Mm-hmm.
And so then I was commo chief, but if something had to be signed by a higher rank, then he would have to sign that stuff.
All right. And how long did you spend then doing that?
Well, then, that was probably about 6 months or something like that.
Okay. All right. Now, you're there, you're in Germany, it's the time of the Cold War, the Korean War is going on, that kind of thing. How concerned were you about the possibility of a war starting in Germany?
Well, they were worried about that. We had, for example, at one time, this was still when I was a tanker, they called us out, about 4:30 in the morning, said, we're having to be ready for anything because the East Germans are having maneuvers. And so they said at 10 o'clock in the morning, this large tank is going to pull up on a precipice there. It's going to get there at 10 o'clock in the morning, and it's supposed to leave at 10:30. So you're to go there at an observation point where you can see that tank, and if he leaves, which we expect him to do, then you go to this other location, and at that location you're sitting near a park and so forth, but across from you is a woods. And at dusk, 1,000 infantry troops, East Germans, are supposed to move into that woods. And in the morning they're supposed to leave. And they said, we don't know if they will or not, but if they decide they're coming across the line, the border, then you're to immediately leave, and because of your location, you have to cross this stream. And there's a barn across this stream. That barn is like a bridge, and they said, don't worry about opening the doors, you just go through there and cross the bridge with your tank.
Mm-hmm.
But how did we know to such detail that this was going to happen? So our Secret Service in East Germany was very good at that time, because how otherwise would they have the exact time for that tank? And it was there at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And the troops coming into this woods across the border from us, they had the time set, and it happened just like they said it would.
Yeah. I mean, unless the East Germans provided the information to avoid an incident happening accidentally, it's the only other thing I can think of.
I don't know how, but I do know that our espionage was very effective at that time.
All right. Because you kind of usually think of the East Germans as being pretty efficient at running their own Secret Service, but at this point, wherever you got it, you had the information. Yeah.
We only had one time when we had an alert that we thought was a real thing. And the way I knew it was not expected was we were working in the motor pool at that time, and the alert signal went off, and I saw one officer yell to me, hey, did you get that? Yeah. They rushed to the barracks and took their equipment, their duffel bags, with them. So they hadn't been expecting to do that during an alert, they just, and so then we knew that something had happened, and we were on alert for 3 days and came back. We found out Fox Company had come to the border, and the cooks from different companies would sell some of the food and stuff like that to people sneaking across the border. And these were some people that had come back with their goods, and here was this Fox Company at Border Patrol. They looked around, and here's all these Germans coming, and the patrol leader got afraid, and he said, open fire. By the time they got done shooting, there were 8 dead East Germans laying there, and we were all out in the field. Well, to settle this, when they found out exactly what happened, then they said, East Germany said, we'll not hold you against killing these people or anything if you promise not to let Fox Company do border patrol until everybody in the company have been recycled. Which I was happy about at that time, because we didn't like the 1 month where you had nothing to do. So then you had, you know, it was, but the surprise was the solution that they came to afterwards. You know, if you let Fox Company recycle, and then we won't hold you responsible for it. And so that was something. But
all right. Now, are there other particular events or impressions that kind of stand out in your memory from that time in Germany?
well, this just has to do with my job. I was the Calmo chief, so then I had to, if something happened, I'd have to go over and check up on it like that. And my company commander says, if I have any communications problems, he said, Bill, you've got to do it. I don't want one of those other guys doing it. Well, then there was a call that there was some communications problem, and so whenever I had to travel, I had a Jeep, and I thought it was kind of strange that here sits this PFC, has his own Jeep, and he's got his driver. But anyway, this driver said, hey, we don't have to go way around. There's an open field there, and we can cut across that, and we'd save a lot of time. Okay, and I said, okay, let's do that. So we just crossed the fence, and going down this path, and I hear this sound, whoosh, 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 boom. I says, this is an artillery range, they're practicing, get out of here. So we hastened back and went the long way around.
Right. Okay. Now, while you're in Germany and as a private, you don't get to bring your family along. So your wife was back home?
Yeah, well, it wouldn't have, no, you wouldn't have anyway, but even if it would, because of our being in and out, it wouldn't have really worked. So very few people, well, none of the guys in our particular unit would have their family there.
So was she just back in Iowa teaching school?
She was back in Iowa teaching school.
Okay. And how much communication did you have with her while you were gone?
She wrote every day, and I tried to write too, but no, she wrote every day.
Okay. Now, you're in Germany then for a year and a half or something like that?
Yes.
Okay. And so during that time, you don't get to go back home at
No.
any time? No, so you're just stuck
No.
away that whole
We
time?
could have short leaves to visit parts of Germany.
Yeah. Yeah, but there wasn't. And of course, in those days, most of the transport back and forth was still by boat, so you couldn't just get a week off and fly home.
No, that's right.
Yeah, okay. So, now, had the Korean War armistice happened by the time you went home? Because it's middle of '53.
I don't think it was completely finished, but I'm not sure. That was winding down. It was,
Yeah.
for all practical purposes, there was not any combat interchange.
Yeah. But while you were there initially, there were people being transferred out of your unit to go to Korea, so you
Yes.
had some of them. But
Yes.
that didn't affect you, and the war, and that shuts down. So, now, were you only in for a 2-year hitch because you were
Yes.
drafted? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Because you were spending your time in Germany, you knew you weren't going to have to go to Korea yourself.
You didn't know anything if you were not a higher officer.
Okay.
When something happened, you'd get your orders and you'd do it, and you were not part of the planning program, you know.
Okay. Now, did the Army make any effort to get you to stay, other than at the time you were training?
Well, one was, you know, you can have your rank.
Right, for the 6 months more.
Yeah.
But I mean, in terms of re-enlisting for 2 years or 4 years or something like that, I mean, did they try to encourage you to do that?
Not so that, you know, I don't think they expected these. I think they expected that they were going to be cutting down on the service as the war was winding down.
Yeah.
That's what I'm guessing.
Yeah, so they really didn't need the extra guys anymore anyway, so.
No, they
Okay,
were cutting down.
all right. And then, how much advance notice did you have of when you were gonna go home?
Well, basically probably a couple weeks, or, you know, we knew that they were recycling, and so we were expecting at the end of our 2 years, we were gonna be back home, so.
Right. Okay. And then, what was the return trip like?
Well, on the return trip, this is an interesting story for me. We got on, it was a smaller ship than we went down, but then you do the southern route. And of course, that's the route where you have hurricanes and storms and stuff. So one day, the people on the ship were stringing ropes along the walkways. Said, what's that for? Well, they said, we're gonna hit the storm, and when we do, if they have to go out, they have to have a rope that they can have so that they don't get washed overboard. And of course, everybody on the ship got so sick, and I didn't get sick. The only place that I could be where people were not up chucking was the latrine on the back end of the ship. Here's this big latrine. I spent the day there all by myself, because everybody was so sick. They were just, you know, you could not be where everybody else was.
Wow.
And so, and then the back end of the ship would come up and the screw would be out of the water and pop, 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 and then it would be down. But that's where I spent that entire day. Then we got far enough out, everything settled down, so the next, I was back in my barracks the next day.
Right. I guess if people were sick, you'd kind of expect them to be in a latrine, but,
Well, they never got that. That latrine was in the back of the ship, and nobody came there.
okay. So they'd have to move that far to get there, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Now, and then where did you land in the States?
Well, we went through, you know, we saw the statue, you know, of Liberty.
So New York.
And so we landed in New York there. And then they were gonna fly us to Chicago in planes. And the interesting thing was we took off, there were a whole bunch of planes. We took off, and I was in one of the first 4 planes, and then they radioed, they said the weather is too rough, don't send anybody else. So this plane, it was really, really rough. We'd fly up and then it would drop down halfway up, and so the weather was too rough, they said, you know. But we were too far into it, so we didn't turn back. So we landed in Chicago then. And from there, then my wife came there and met me, and we went back.
Okay. So now, and this is the point you mentioned a little bit earlier on about what happens to you. You get home.
Yeah, when we landed in Chicago, and my wife's sister and her husband, he was going to Calvin College. So she said, you know, let's go around, and she had come meet me with the car, so we drove to Grand Rapids and visit with her sister and her husband, and for a few days, and then we drove back to Iowa. And since my dad had gotten sick and my brother, just younger than me, was released from the service to take care of the farm, where we had planned to live was not available. And I said, I'm not going to just stay around here being hired by somebody. So I said, why don't I go to Calvin College on the GI Bill? And so my parents were kind of disappointed about that. My mother was more upset because they liked the style of things I did. But anyway, went to Grand Rapids on the GI Bill. And then my wife worked part-time while I was going to school. So then after I got finished with school, I don't have a very good mathematical ability, but I had no trouble memorizing all these complex terms in biology. So I decided to teach biology, and so when I finished with biology, I got 2 two contracts that I could go to. One of them was to Christian High for $3,400, and Seymour Junior High needed a teacher, and they said, married man can't live on that, we'll give you $4,000. So that's why then I taught in junior high for several years, and then an opening came at Calvin College, and there were quite a few people applying for that, but it just so happened that the people who were on the school board at Seymour, a lot of them had kind of moved up with their kids, and they were at Christian High, and so I was very fortunate because I got the job. And then I taught biology and at Grand Rapids Christian High.
All right. Now, to look back at the time that you spent in the service, how do you think that affected you, or what did you learn from it?
Well, I don't know. You get a little frustrated, you know, because the military has to do things a certain way. But at the same time, growing up in a family of 7 boys, you know, we had to learn to adjust. And so, I don't know, repeat your question.
Well, I was just curious, I mean, how did your service time affect you at all, or did you learn anything from it?
Well, the hardest part of that is being separated while you're married. That is very difficult, and it was probably harder on my wife than it was on me, because we're doing all kinds of new things, challenges, which kept you going. But there were times, you know, when you're really, well, you're just depressed. You know, you're married and your wife's back home. So that part of it was hard. And I was very fortunate because I was a farm kid, it's easy to work with people. So I never really had any conflict with the people I worked with in the service. And I thought that for the most part, you know, things were pretty effective, our military was.
Yeah, and it sounds like you had a good commanding officer and somebody who respected you and appreciated what you did.
Yes,
that
that's
helps.
true. Interesting, our cook for our company happened to be a Christian Forum fellow, good solid Christian, and the Army was supplying us with all kinds of delicious foods like you couldn't believe. But a lot of these other cooks were selling this to the Germans. When somebody came to our company, you know, our company area, they wanted to eat at Easy Company, because there you got a good meal. These other companies were eating leftovers. That was one very dramatic thing I noticed.
And you talked about, I mean, you were functioning, you know, in kind of a leadership capacity or that sort of thing. Now, did that help you as a teacher? Just some practice dealing with people who had to learn stuff?
Yeah. And teaching biology, the students that would want biology were, a lot of times people wanted to go into medicine or nursing or something like that. And so basically I had students who were interested in learning, and so you know, I enjoyed teaching, I enjoyed working with the kids. I was coach for what we call Science Olympiad. It was competition with other schools, and then I'd just go to the students' records, and I'd pick the top higher echelon of IQs. And we competed with these other schools, and they said it was not fair. They said, here you are a special school, and their Science Olympiad people actually went to special classes to learn special things. The kids from Christian High didn't have to do that. You know, they were gifted kids, and they would kind of argue with each other who got to do things. They wanted to do more, not less, you know. I was really impressed with that.
Yep. All right. Okay, well, you've got a good story. You did a good job telling it, so thank you for taking the time to share it today.